Quietly's wife was weeping by the fireside at midnight when there came a knock at the door. She could not think of a single person likely to call on her at such a late hour. Could it be someone wishing to cross the river? She went to the door. Out of fear she did not open it, but only called, "It is too late. Wait till morning, and my father-in-law will take you across." The answer came, "Mama, let me in. It's cold outside." With trembling hands she unlocked the door, and in the porch found her own little girl, the one she had buried a year ago to the day, alive and well. Behind the child was her husband, quietly. She clutched the girl in her arms, wept to have her back, too overjoyed at first to wonder how such a thing had come to pass. Then she thought, "It cannot be," and she held the child at arm's length to stare at her, but it was unmistakably the very same daughter she had lost 12 months before. "Where did you come from?" she asked in wonderment, and the little girl answered, "From that place on the other side of the river. Daddy came to get me." The woman turned her eyes to her husband, quietly stood a little way back from the child, not in the porch, but on the path. "Come in, dear," she said, and opened the door wide and gestured to the hearth where the fire was lit and his pipe was still on the mantel, but quietly did not step forwards. She couldn't help but notice he was altered, though it was hard to say exactly how. Perhaps he was paler and thinner than he had been before, or perhaps it was his eyes that were a darker version of the color they had been before. "Come in," she repeated, and quietly shook his head. She understood then that he would never be able to come inside again. That was an excerpt from the book Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield, which is, to clarify, not actually part of my library or bookshelf, but is a book that my mother lent me to read, specifically because it's by Diane Setterfield, which is an author that I highly recommend, specifically the book The 13th Tale. The 13th Tale is very different to Once Upon a River. Goes kind of with actually my mom's primary critique with Diane Setterfield is every book my mom has read seems very, very different. And, I mean, that is not like a bad critique necessarily. When you really think about it, authors that can write more types of stories and genres really are showcasing their talent. I think the reason it turns into a critique for my mom is my mom enjoys very specific kinds of stories, and if she can't count on an author to constantly deliver that kind of story, she's gonna kind of bow out eventually from reading. But the 13th Tale, really great if you enjoy suspense, history, thriller. There is gonna be something in that book for you. I read it when I was in junior high. I'm a little surprised my mom let me read it at that age, because there are some topics that I think you do gotta be a little careful of in that book. Not that anything is toxic per se, but there's things that you find out happen or implied that happen that could get triggering for people. Specifically with things like maybe there's SA, but we don't really know. Or, bad family relationships that we understand are bad. That type of thing. This book, though, is very, very different, but it was still, I think, a good book. Although I would say I do think the 13th Tale in my memory sits a bit higher for me in the list of, book hierarchy of goodness. So, one of the things that I do like, which does translate from the 13th Tale, is that Diane Setterfield does have a writing style and a voice that just kind of naturally flows. Um, Sometimes, at least in this book, it's almost a little too much, which I'll talk about that here in a moment. But it is genuinely an enjoyable style to read. So, what is the book about? I don't want to give anything too spoilery, because it really is a good read. But the general premise is that we start off in a inn/tavern that is ran by a family that passes from mother to daughter, the inn and business. And this place is really known for storytelling. And on a late night, this man stumbles through the door with what they first think is a doll, but it ends up being a little girl who's probably about 4 years old from what they can tell. And the girl seems to be lifeless from all evidence they can gather. And after, a period of time, the girl suddenly is alive. So there's this tale of a girl who was dead and then suddenly alive again. And it travels throughout the country and into other towns. And you get a couple of different people that lay claims that this girl is a long lost daughter or a granddaughter or a sister. And the book generally spends its time figuring out who this girl is. And also unwrapping these families that have claims or have laid a claim on her. So this book has quite a few characters that you have to keep track of. So I figured I would make a list of the ones I think are the most important. First, you have the Blisses, or the Bliss family. And they are not in most of the book, I would say, but they're still really important. The book starts with them and it ends with them. You get the sense that they're the framework for the storytelling aspect of this book. So there's Margot Bliss, who is the current owner of this inn/tavern where the girl shows up. And there's her husband, Joe, who is considered to be kind of sickly. You get the impression that there's a bit of an amazement that he's still alive, but he is known to be like an award-winning storyteller when it comes to oral storytelling, which I should clarify. This book also takes place in like a Victorian era England, where we've reached the point that photographs are becoming a thing, but there's still a sense where there's people that aren't as educated living in the countryside, and there's not necessarily books just floating around and easily accessible to everyone. So storytelling is a big thing for the people in this world that's built in the book. So, as I said, we have Joe, storyteller, his wife, tavern owner, and then we are told they have a bunch of daughters, but we're never really given the daughters' names. Whenever they're mentioned, they're just called Little Margos. And then there's their youngest, which is their only son, named Jonathan. And Jonathan has some sort of mental impairment. It's not really expressed what that is. They kind of describe him, and if this is, offensive, I'm sorry. I don't really know how else to describe, but he's basically said to be like a little slow, and he's a very sweet-natured boy who helps with the inn and tavern, but he doesn't pick up on things the same way. So again, we don't really know what it is that makes him different, but we're told he's different. I think I have a critique in the fact that him having any types of issues somewhat feels like he's kind of like a token character because of how little this family really is in the greater scheme of the story. However, it does bring perspective into the ending and, has a point and a purpose. It's just, again, it's part of the ending, and I don't really want to give away the ending. So, it's interesting, and it has its highs and lows, I guess, in my mind. The second family I remember us getting introduced to are the Armstrongs, and we learn most of what we understand about the Armstrongs through the eyes of Mr. Armstrong. I believe, if I remember right, his name is Robert. And I don't want to give too much about his backstory away, but what you have to understand first and foremost, and it's pretty much said within the first time you meet the family, Robert Armstrong is a black man who married a white woman who appears to have had some disabilities in life herself, although hers are physical instead of mental. She has a limp and she has a bad eye. And they love each other very much. They have loads of kids. They live on a farm. He has some type of wealth due to his background, which I'm not going to get too much into. And the other thing that's kind of brought up right away is that their oldest child is not biologically his, but he has raised their oldest child as his own. And that becomes a big plot point, specifically with that family. So they are a claimant to the child. I'm not going to say exactly how, because theirs is a little bit more by proxy, I guess. The next family we get introduced to are the Vaughns, and the Vaughns are Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn. I forget Mr. Vaughn's name because he's just called Vaughn the entire time for the most part. But Mrs. Vaughn is Helena, and we're given a bit of their backstory before we even see why they're relevant, which is that Helena married Mr. Vaughn somewhat out of convenience. It is implied that they do love each other and there is a loving relationship, but when they did get married, part of it had to do with her father dying and she having no one else to turn to. What we learn about them is that they had a little girl who disappeared via kidnapping when she was 2 years old. And, I mean, their claim is pretty obvious. They think when they hear about this little girl that this is their long-lost daughter because it's been about 2 years to the day when this girl is found. And, I mean, I guess I should say Helena Vaughn is more convinced than Mr. Vaughn. Because Mr. Vaughn arrives when there's other people claiming. But Helena is very, very excited about the girl, and very clearly they have been living in grief for 2 years. To the extent where it's basically destroying their marriage almost, because Helena's a shell of herself. Mr. Vaughn doesn't know how to let his grief out, and that is explored with them further. Then we meet, although she might be a little bit after some of these other characters, there's also Lily White, who we kind of get bits and pieces about her as the book progresses. But she hears about the little girl, and she comes running saying it's her little sister. And one of the first things you read about Lily White is that she's middle-aged, and so it sounds completely crazy that this middle-aged woman has a 4-year-old little sister. And, I mean, her claim is not taken very seriously. There's things that kind of come out as the story progresses. Again, I'm not going to get into that. But she has a very mental fascination attachment to this girl. Essentially everybody does, but we get Lily White specifically. What we learn about her is that she was married and her husband was abusive, and she now lives with another man who is not always there, but he's also abusive. We learn more about what all that entails as the book progresses. What we do know is Lily works for a parson, and most people that know her, like, all just think she's sweet. And then the last isn't a family, but it is a group of two people. There is Henry Daunt and then Rita. So Mr. Daunt is the man who finds the little girl that showed up with everyone believing she's dead. And he's a photographer, and he feels a weird attachment to the girl too. In his parts of it, from his point of view, he talks about having been married, not having kids, and how that was something that was hurtful for his wife. And you get the sense that he wishes he had children, but that relationship is no more. I can't remember if it's really explained why. And at this point, he's a photographer that has a riverboat, and he goes up and down the river and takes pictures. Rita is a midwife/nurse who lives in the same town that the Inn Tavern is in. And she's the one who examines the girl, proclaims that she's dead, but then realizes she's alive, after a period of time. And Rita feels a very big attachment to the girl that she doesn't know how to explain. I think as a reader, you can make a connection about Rita and the girl being connected due to what Rita's backstory is, which is that she was an abandoned child and raised by nuns, and that is how she came by a lot of her education in terms of science and health services. Although by the point in the book, she doesn't believe in God anymore, so she's not religious, but she owes that to helping her, and that's acknowledged. And the reason I pair them together is they kind of end up teaming up, and they're kind of how we get from family to family by midway through the book, because it's them visiting one family that has a claim and talking to the family about what their thoughts and feelings are, and then eventually we kind of get to this place where they're the ones that are actually solving the mystery of what happened and who this girl is. So they are pretty important, and they do go together. It's an interesting setup. From here, I'm going to open up some themes, which I want to mention the front cover when we're talking about themes. So the cover I'm showing is the cover that is of the version I have. I have seen some older covers where it's pretty similar, but there is a key difference. First being, when you look at the cover of my copy at first glance, it looks like a river with flowers, but then you realize it's actually like a swan neck and head once you look at the upper right corner. Other copies I've seen, it literally is a river and not a swan. But I think these play very well into the themes, and it gives you a good idea of what you're getting into thematically, which is rivers and storytelling. Rivers by It Looks Like a River, and storytelling by, I was thinking about the swan and the story of the ugly duckling, which isn't really what's being told here, but it does fit with some other sub-themes, I guess I would say. The most obvious theme in this book is going to be, or should be mentioned as, storytelling, because it is set up very quickly from the start that the inn is a place where storytellers gather and stories are told. And the reason that people find out about this little girl that is found and pulled out of the river, I don't know if I mentioned that's where she is found and how they suspect she died when they think she's dead, is that she drowned. There's this element where people start, building stories about what they think happened, and that's what gets spread to these neighboring towns where these other families are at that make these claims. And there's a lot to be said about, this line of where is story and where is reality. How connected are they? Are they really connected at all? And I think the book pushes to tell you that they're deeply connected to the point where it's almost indistinguishable. The excerpt I read at the beginning actually comes from a story that's told to you, and it's probably the only story told to you that doesn't have to do with the girl in the first half of the book, and it's about who they call Quietly on the River. And this is a ferryman that finds people that are drowning or dying in the river, and if it's not your time, he saves you and brings you back to where you need to go. And if it is your time, well, he plucks you from the river and takes you on to the afterlife, essentially. And the story we get told is like how he became who he is, which is more of like a ghost specter than anything else in this half existence. And I mean, you're also supposed to see parallels with there being a daughter, and I mean, there's lots of things that are open to discussion, but the big thing that comes from that story is that the people in this book, most of them very much believe that Quietly is real, and they claim to see Quietly, and it leads to a lot of discussions that get started and then tampered away by the people that don't want to open the can of worms of, oh, what if this is all real and true? It also brings up with storytelling the idea of changelings, which this is probably more of a sub-theme that could be even taken separately of storytelling. But there's a lot of things looking into the idea of, can we replace one thing for another that looks identical but isn't the same? And that is explored through these families all having claims where they go, well, this is this person, or this child is this other person. And they all very strongly, at the beginning at least, seem to all believe that their claim is the correct one. And then they second guess themselves, and we kind of get to points where they come to conclusions by the end of what's actually true. And I mean, it's opening different cans of worms. The reason I put that as maybe a sub-theme of storytelling is because changeling is an idea that comes from folklore. If you're not familiar with the idea of a changeling, my understanding is that they're usually considered like fairy children, where your child, like a newborn child, gets swapped out with a fairy child instead for the family to raise. And like, you could kind of make some connections with the ugly duckling, although I don't remember that being an intentional egg swapping type of thing. But it's more like, there was an egg that made its way into the nest that wasn't from them, And I mean, that has some interesting things to consider. The second big theme is rivers. Obviously, we're talking about Once Upon a River. The idea with the river is that there's multiple towns, and you can reach all of them by walking down the river, and using that as your guidepost. They also talk about river gypsies, which I could have mentioned earlier. This is not talked about enough for me to think of it as like an uber important detail in the book. but there's talk about river gypsies doing bad things. I don't think that that's important. There's talk about quietly, as we mentioned before. There's just a lot that comes with people talking about their experiences with the river and traveling from one place to the other or seeing another person. It also kind of thematically goes with the ideas of like life and the flow of time, especially because we see a lot of the families, like especially the Vaughns, talking about, oh, this all happened 2 years ago and now we're here, and trying to connect the dots in between, you know. It causes some interesting conversations. I also think like a lot of this river talk with the travel and the passage of time, it's a metaphor. It's a giant metaphor for the other themes. And there's lots of times where the river is used to describe something else that's going on. And sometimes those are interesting things. I'll leave it at that because those happen in the second half of the book of what I'm really thinking of. The other big theme that I thought was important to talk about was the idea of family dynamics. Each claiming group or person seems to come from a different type of family. With the Armstrongs, as I said before, the oldest son, he's not biologically Mr. Armstrong's. He was raised as Mr. Armstrong's. And there we get like a blended family where people kind of came together. Now, the children aren't necessarily aware to a huge extent about it being a blended family, but it still is a blended family. There's history prior to the relationship, and then there's history afterwards that involve at least one child. Then with the Vaughns, you get what I'm kind of denoting as an arranged or given family, like the family that you don't choose but are given, like your brothers or sisters almost are, because they did choose each other, but there was something about it that does feel kind of arranged, especially from how it's talked about. And I mean, I think that also changes how their dynamic works, especially when they are working through grief. With Lily White, we get the idea of broken family because she's going from abusive relationship to abusive relationship, and then we learn more about her backstory towards the end. And it just feels like nobody has been there for her, really. And with Rita and Dawn, I don't want to give too much away, but I'd label them as found family because they both feel deep connections to the girl. They want, in a lot of ways, to claim the girl as their own, each individually, even though they know they don't have a claim. And that's part of what turns them to looking into the mystery of who this girl is and what is actually the truth, because they feel responsible. And in a lot of ways, that builds a family connection within themselves as the book progresses, which is interesting. But I think just families, with all of those being present, is a huge thing in the book. And not just comparing and contrasting, but also how families interact with each other, since all of them do interact with each other. And at the end, you have them all coming back to the inn. Like, you have them all going to the inn in the beginning and all coming back at the end. It's very, like, tied up, and they're all interacting. My overall opinion of this book was that it was a good book. It wasn't the best book I've ever read, maybe. I gave it, like, 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. And I'm not saying this isn't a 5-star book, necessarily. This is my subjective opinion, and I think part of that flows from, if the 13th Tale is a 5-star book, this can't be a 5-star book, when we're talking Diane Setterfield. But it's not a bad book. I'd read it again. I did enjoy it. But I will say it did take a bit to get into it. And I don't think that is necessarily the fault of anything in particular. Um, I did think about it, and I think it kind of boils down to one, the book is about storytelling and rivers, and Diane Setterfield, as I've said before, her writing just flows. And if I am being honest, I did fall asleep reading this book at one point, at least, maybe 2 times. And this was in the beginning of the book, not by the middle or the end. It was early on, and I think part of it was because of her writing style and what we're dealing with and how story-like it is. It's very, very, very like Once Upon a Time type feeling. There's also the sense that there's so many characters, and for a while you're just going each chapter meeting someone new, and you can't figure out why they're connected for a bit. Like, it becomes obvious once they find the girl, but it takes like 20% into the book, if I'm remembering right, to get there. So you kind of feel like you're getting more and more information, and you're waiting forever for any type of payoff, even a slight payoff, which isn't bad. There's plenty of great books out there that don't give you payoff until like even the second half. I think, I don't know how much of it comes from like the culture of reading like fanfics where people post chapters weekly, and you have to have something that keeps people wanting to, tune back in next week type of thing. And not even just that, you can even apply that to like TV shows or serials where there's something that has to keep the viewer, always into it. Whereas this is like a slower piece of content to digest and to read. On the flip side, her writing style and the fact that I did fall asleep isn't necessarily a negative to me, because it did remind me of my childhood. And I mean, I kind of alluded to it in my episode 1 where I talked about my history with reading. My mom read to me like every night, and I have very distinct memories of falling asleep to her reading, although she didn't usually like that. But that's just part of growing up to me, and it gives me nostalgia, and I kind of enjoyed falling asleep mid-chapter. I didn't enjoy that sometimes I feel like I forget pieces of the beginning because of that, but I did think it was good. And I mean, once you get into it, it does move, and the plot is continuously like raising questions and answering other questions, but it always leaves you with something to keep you going once you do get into it. And that was, like, as I said, maybe 20% into the book. I mean, otherwise, I will say about the ending, it has some vaguity to it from my point of view. And I think that is intentional, and whether it is good or bad, I don't think it is for me to say. Part of me wishes it was less vague, because I like feeling like there was something that really strongly resolved, and it's because I like mystery books. But this one, they solved the mystery, but it doesn't always feel like they did, just from how it ends. So that's all I'll say about the ending. I'm not going to give away anything else about it. Hopefully it wasn't too spoilery. I will say, going forward, I'm probably going to try to think about where I can and can't give spoilers, because I'm going to be honest, I like spoilers. I prefer spoilers, because if I am looking for something to read or watch, I need to know if the ending is happy. Because if it isn't, I either have to be mentally prepared going in, or I'm just not going to read it or watch it. Usually with reading, I'm more likely to read a sad book than, not. But, like, especially with watching, like, a movie or a show, if it has a sad ending, I can't handle it. And I like to know ahead of time. But I know other people don't. So, hopefully, if you listen to this, it wasn't too spoilery. And, I mean, it is a good book, so I do highly encourage, if you've never read Diane Setterfield, this isn't a bad book to pick up. This is a good one. And, I mean, if this doesn't appeal to you with storytelling and mystery that feels very flowy, do pick up, I think, The 13th Tale. That one has less characters to keep track of in terms of, like, the big characters. And it is also a book that I think does a really good job at driving suspense at a steady pace. So that would be my suggestion. And if you like this book, I'm sure, like, you would like... I think if you like one, it doesn't mean you won't like the other. Like, as I said, I liked this book too. It just didn't hit as good for me. But that is all that I have to say on this book. I am already like 20% in through the next book that I have, which is a book that I do own, and it's called Things in Jars by Jess Kidd. I already know a lot of things that I want to talk about with that book at this point, so I will get back to y'all when that is done, and my time is up. Bye.